Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll profile Dilworth, Minnesota artist Barry Vasquez. But first, our guest now is Dr. Diana D'Amico Palowitz. And I hope I got all that right.
You did.
With the University of North Dakota, and you're with the College of Education and Human Development.
Yeah.
Well, we're here to talk about a book you wrote and some other things, but before we do that, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and maybe your background.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on. This is a treat. In terms of my work, I am a historian of education policy and school reform. And I've been a professor for some time, but this is only my second year down at UND. I'm originally from New York City, and then before coming here, I was a professor outside of Washington, D.C., and we moved here for just an incredible opportunity. The University of North Dakota is doing some really exciting things and quality of life to raise our 4 kids out here.
Well, and of course, you're here today to talk about kind of the educational system, even in the United States, and your book here. And I'm going to put it up, Blaming Teachers, Professionalization Policies, and the Failure of Reform in American History. A mouthful there. So tell us about the book and why you wrote it.
Yeah, well, so why did I write this book? I've been working on this project for some time, and I think there are a couple things that came together. The first is that as a historian, from early on, I had this understanding that public education is not just about classrooms. These aren't just kind of these sealed off institutions, but public schools are like windows onto American society. So if we want to learn about political debates or social anxieties or the aspirations of the nation, public schools are an amazing place to look. And that's certainly playing out now today. And then at the time the project was starting, we were kind of right in the midst of this NCLB moment. And what I was hearing just a ton of was, it's those darn teachers, right? A lot of blaming teachers, a lot of trying to reform teachers. And so it was kind of what was going on at that moment set me back to, how did we get to where we are right now? So that's really what the book was about.
Yeah, so why is it so easy to blame the teachers?
Right.
And why is it that professional is sort of politicized?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there's a couple of reasons why it's so easy to blame teachers today. I think the first reason is because we've always been doing it. It's become kind of like the grammar of public schooling, right? We have, why do we sit kids in rows and desks? Why do we organize them by grades? Why do we blame teachers? That's what public school has been about, right? I think another reason why we blame teachers is because, in some ways they're easy targets. They become the consummate straw man, and it's much easier to blame teachers than it is to say, gosh, we have to reform the entire system, or think about social inequality or something like that. The reason why we originally started blaming teachers goes back to a story from really the mid-19th century with the rise of public schools, where there was not a lot of faith in public school teachers, and particularly the women that were recruited to schools. And so embedded in this blame that we see was a lot of gendered discourse about why women weren't up to the task, why they weren't doing well enough. And so that really has set the table for this policy story that has shaped public schooling.
Yeah, but can you talk about I guess, the New York City school system in particular, which you do write about?
Yeah.
And the struggles teachers have there and faced over the years?
Yeah. So the book is sort of about New York City in some ways. That's kind of how we enter into the story. And in a lot of ways, New York City is this kind of exceptional story. There's not a lot of cities like it. It's huge there. But in the other ways, though, it is this kind of evocative case in that it's been a theater for all kinds of policy debates, that we have the way unions sort of started there and spread out across the country, the debates in teacher education. So one of the things I write about in the book is how big cities like New York City have become this kind of harbinger for education policy that we see across. But one of the things I see in the book is that, from very early on, there's a lot of faith in the ability of public schools to fix social problems. And then when those schools kind of fall short, right, when they're not doing the things that we hoped they would do, there's a whole lot of hand-wringing there. And attention turns pretty quickly to teachers, right, and policymakers. And this goes back to the, mid-1800s and plays out in the present still. We'll say, gosh, if only we had better teachers. well, then we'd have better schools, right? And so what teachers have been trapped in is this cycle of reform that has kind of put one policy over another in an attempt to kind of make them better in some way. But the key is that those policies, what they have ended up doing is really just creating this bureaucratic system of schooling where it was really focused on standardization and measurement and efficiency. And so even though we constantly talk about this idea of teacher professionalization, what teachers, I think a lot of them would tell us is that, you know, my authority has been taken away, my autonomy has taken away, and gosh, I don't feel like I have a whole lot of respect. And those are the critical markers of profession. So it really is this story about how we talk about profession in name, but the things that we've done to teachers have really kind of cut them off at the knees.
Yeah. Well, you talked about unions right there a moment, but you write about the pros and cons of teachers' unions. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Yeah. You know, I think the first thing to understand is that the unions that we have are a reflection of the public schools that we have, right? If our public schools were organized in a different kind of way, then we would not have teacher representation the way we do. But the reason we have it the way this is because there really is no other opportunity for teachers to have their voices heard. And I think that, you know, there's been this kind of complex history of the role of teacher unions. Sometimes they've clashed heads with communities, but I think what we're seeing right now is a new page in the history of teacher unionization, where there's a lot of collaboration with communities, there's a lot of advocacy, not just for what's best for teachers' material interests, but what's best for schools, what's best for communities. So we've seen when teachers are going on strike, it's not really just for these bread and butter issues, but it's also for more school support services and really standing in defense of public education. And I think one of the things that we're seeing lately is that unions have played a really important role even in this COVID moment, right? Is that so many parents and policymakers and politicians are anxious to just open up schools, right? Get kids back in so that we can have whatever normal feels like. The union has been a really key player in saying, we want that too, but we also need safe schools, right? And I think teachers have a lot of reason to feel somewhat cautious because as any of them could tell us, there have been many times they've gone into school and haven't had hand sanitizer or haven't had soap in the bathrooms or things like that. And so now I think, you know, they need some more than kind of a general promise that there will be masks and things. There needs to be some kind of evidence of that because it is a huge risk, not just for them, but for all the families that send their kids back. And the union has been a key role in pressing for that, even as it's been unpopular.
Yeah, and you mentioned COVID, and let's talk about that just a minute. I guess now, especially during the COVID for the last quite a few months, we've seen how schools are sometimes sort of child care centers for parents. Can you talk about the immense challenges COVID has put on the education system?
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, I think one of the things that's been most interesting about this pandemic is that it really has illuminated for so many of us all the things that public education does for a community, right? I think a lot of people might have been flippant, you know, gosh, a teacher's work is so simple and they're just, you know, just work from 9 to 3 and, and it's just about teaching kids and how hard could that be? And I think what they're realizing now is that not only is the task of working with children enormously complex, but it's not even just about that, right? Schools are about so much more. They're about warm meals for kids in need. They're about safe spaces for kids who might not have one, and also critical services for kids who have disabilities. And so I think that really has brought a lot of attention or been eye-opening for folks, and that parents struggling at home are realizing that, you know, the work of schooling is just hard business.
Well, and of course, even the social interaction that we all need. But what about, you know, a lot of parents have struggled during COVID, you know, whether it's because, you know, they've had work or really weren't equipped to effectively monitor an at-home school learning with their child. Can you talk more about that? Yeah,
I mean, being a full-time working parent, being home with kids and trying to monitor their learning is a huge challenge for me personally with my 4 kids, but for any parent, you know. And I think also part of the complexity though is that, you know, schools were really struggling to figure out how to do this. They didn't have a whole lot of time. They certainly didn't have a whole lot of resources. You know, we didn't really see this pandemic coming. So the first time and back in the last spring when we shut down schools, there was no time for teachers to really think about what does meaningful meaningful online learning look like. It was just this kind of scramble. And I think even that's been the same. I think we spent a lot of time this summer not telling teachers where we were, what we were going to do, and there were no additional resources given to say, folks, let's talk about what high quality online instruction looks like and how we create that. I think what a lot of kids are experiencing is this kind of, teachers are just putting things together as best as they possibly can, and it's complicated. In our own home, internet was out this morning. So
what do you do then?
What do you do? Yeah.
Let's stick with online learning for a moment. It seems to have failed for many children, or at least been a struggle for many.
Yeah.
I say it that way. Can you comment on that? Why is it that? I mean, why has that been that way for so many?
It's a good question, and I don't have a set answer for that. What I would say, though, is that I think that while some kids have struggled, some kids have realized this has actually been great for them. I think also it's hard to judge the efficacy of online learning by what we see happening right now, because of what I was just talking about a moment ago, is that this has been put together, right, so quickly that teachers really didn't have time to learn all these different platforms, to think about how they might use them. And so, I think that's hard. But I also think something that you mentioned earlier is absolutely right, is that there's a huge social component in learning. It's really hard to duplicate that. I mean, I feel that in my own classes when I teach adults that, we have amazing conversations online, and I'm so grateful for the hard work my students do, but it's just not the same as sitting face to face and having those conversations.
With that, I mean, do you foresee, I hope you've got a better crystal ball than me,
right,
that schools will be open for all in-person starting fall 2021, even though quite a few are definitely going in person now?
I sure hope so. And I think it'll rest on a few things: how well we do with the vaccine, can we delay gratification in other ways, right? I think that if we're willing to not do some other things, that schools might be a perfectly safe space, right? And I think in terms of the university, they've been doing a great job. They're talking about vaccinating faculty. They've been doing a ton of testing, and there are already lots of classes that are face-to-face. And so that's been working pretty well at the university.
With that said, what do you teach at UND? What courses, and what approach are you taking with your students?
Yeah, well, I have had the great opportunity to teach and to create some new classes moving forward. So I teach history of education, which is no shock. I'm also teaching a course on scholarly writing, which is a lot of fun because that's what I do kind of in my profession. But then there's also new courses on teacher education, and next semester on education policy. And in terms of, what I'm doing with my students, there's this mixture of trying to cover the same ground that we would have those same rich debates and conversations that we would have face to face, but also really being mindful that this is such an extraordinary, exceptional time. And I think we all have to have a lot of grace with one another. I think that's really critical. I find it problematic to think that we will all end this exactly where we would have had there never been a pandemic, right? Especially when we think about kids and student learning. These are arbitrary measures that we set up, right? This idea of what a child is supposed to know at a certain place, these really are just arbitrary. And so I think we have to there has to be some kindness we give to ourselves, to our society, to say, we got through this pandemic, right? And now we're going to move forward and not fret over, these kind of measurements and things like that.
What is your best advice, I guess, for students who are thinking of going into the teaching profession?
Yeah, well, go to a college of education like the University of North Dakota. Don't try and run around that. I think that there are pathways that people can get into the classroom without getting a professional preparation, and that's problematic. I think it doesn't arm them with the kind of professional knowledge and experience that they really need. I think learn about the communities and the kids that you're going to work with, and from the start, really realize that what you're doing is not just limited to your classroom, but that your classroom is shaped by the communities that kids are coming from, whether or not they've had a warm breakfast, do they have a safe place to play, and all of these things. And so to think about what you're doing, not just about this homework assignment, but the bigness of how you're engaging a kid in their life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's get back to your book for a moment. You write about the ways in which female and male teachers get along or are treated in the education system. Can you touch on this?
Yeah, gender is a really important part of understanding the teaching profession. We can't talk about teachers as if it's a genderless profession. The fact of the matter is today and historically, it's been a field dominated by women. And that's been by design. But that kind of composition has also meant that teachers have been limited in a lot of ways. So one of the examples that you can see that at play is that we have teachers, women, but then they're managed by largely male populations, right? And when we think about policymakers and reformers, so it's a lot of these dynamics of men talking about how women ought to do their work better. And so that is a historical phenomenon that has played out.
Yeah. So why was teaching such a female-dominated profession in the 19th and 20th century, and how much is it still that way today, or how much has it changed?
Yeah. Well, so one of the stories I write about in my book, and I tell people when I talk about this history, is that, in the mid-19th century, public schooling was not a new idea. It was actually a really unpopular idea. Folks were not interested in it. The idea of public education felt like, governmental overreach, public waste of money, and things like that. By the 1850s, though, something changes, and that's immigration. We've got huge numbers of immigrants coming along the Northeast in the United States. And all of a sudden, there becomes a lot of anxiety about what's happening or not happening in the home, right? And so from very early on, this public schools become a way to sort of fit in for what's not happening in these deficient homes, these homes that were perceived as deficient, and that teachers were perceived as these kind of stand-in mothers who could bring these kind of values that they maybe weren't getting. So very early on, that's what brought women to the field. In addition to that, there was a sense that we have these systems. We need a lot of folks. We need folks who are rule followers, right? And we need folks who aren't going to cost us a lot of money. And at that time, everybody was like, it's the ladies.
Well, so how do you think the public views teachers as a whole today?
Yeah. I think that teachers live on a two-sided coin that kind of flips at the drop of a hat. And on one side of that coin is this idea of teacher as savior, right? We are celebrating them as self-sacrificing public servants. And you think about last March, the kind of parades that we were having in communities of kids and parents waving to teachers as they're driving through, and all the parents saying, gosh, I'm so grateful for the teachers. I didn't realize all you did. But that flips pretty quickly. And on the other side of that coin is this story of teacher blame, right? Where teacher is the problem. And we're blaming teachers for being greedy or self-interested if they're not doing what we want them to do. And that's very much where we are right now, right? In a lot of communities, we're blaming teachers and unions for the fact that schools aren't opening, when teachers really are just saying, hey, we want schools to open, just safely.
Sure.
Right.
So, teacher salaries. Always been talked about, I think, as long as I've been living. Yeah. So why is that such a debate, and why teacher salaries seem to be low?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it traces back to this gendered history, right? Initially, there was the argument that we're paying teachers, we're paying women what they're worth. And early on, the idea was that women workers are not worth as much as male counterparts, right? And I think that because of this kind of bureaucratic nature of schooling, we need a lot of teachers, that there are arguments that even though in districts the largest expenditures go to teachers, go to teacher salaries, it's still not very much, as you just said, right? Teachers are paying much less, earning much less than they would in other professions, which is an endemic problem that schools are going to have to face and are facing when it comes to recruiting.
Well, as people might get a chance to read your book, does it relate as New York City as it would in Grand Forks, North Dakota?
Yeah, I think the book really tells a story about what's happening in the United States, right? So it's focused on New York City, but there are examples from across. And I think that what we see happening, there are key differences in communities, right? There are almost 14,000 school districts in the United States, and they are each local, right, and based on these distinctive features. But there's also like these similar attributes, and that's what the book talks about. And so, yeah, I've been surprised moving to Grand Forks after growing up in New York City about how much actually is the same. It's not as different as I might have thought it would have been.
And what's been the reaction so far to the book?
It's been very positive. Yeah, it's been very positive, been well received by other historians and academics, and it's got a great reception, popular audiences. I was able to do a launch of the book with Randy Weingarten, who's the president of the AFT.
Well, with that said, where can people get more information or find a copy of your book? I'll just say Blaming Teachers.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's widely available online. So you can get it through the publisher at Rutgers University Press, Amazon.com, Bookshop, if you want to support local booksellers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you for
and best
having
of luck
me.
to you.
I appreciate it.
Stay tuned for more. Bear Vasquez is an artist who specializes in painting, ceramics, and other forms of art. Originally from Peru, she found her artistic calling after moving with her husband to Dilworth, Minnesota.
All my topics have to be related to my background, where I am from. I'm coming from an Inca culture. I was born in Peru. I live in front of a port, so it's very active. We are close to the mountains, to the Andes, and also close to the Amazon as well. And so we are connected by culture and environment. I think my town is a lot of proudness about our culture. I think I normally realized that I was more interested in art when I came here at Morehead. This is not a very multicultural place. I couldn't find a job, and so I began searching for my inner self. That is when all my love wake up for art. Paintings, because of the colors that they are, they are alive, they are bright. I think they speak, about my technique a lot. I install them here sometimes in my house. For me, it's so important because my paintings take me more than a year. I really love it to have it with me because I come back. Yeah, I can still, be pushing away. I can see many people also, just being attached to one media, and they keep that, but that is not how my brain works. I would like, somebody to study my brain probably and to see why I switch so much. So what happens with me is mostly the theme. I choose a theme, and the theme brings me to the media. They can be sculpture, they can be ceramic, or they can be paintings, or they can be like a mixed media. Many times I have to even learn how to do it. So I have to teach myself. Material mostly is just a way for me to inform about a specific topic. I make a lot of things for fun, but I'm very political. I have one topic about Joe Arpaio, the sheriff, that used to make all Latinos wear pink underwears. So I make his face using underwears. So that was new because I have to sew, I have to embroider. I never did that before. So I get moved by the topic. I began wondering who are the people that married, these dictators. Who were the women that are okay having husbands that, commit genocide crimes. So I began embroidering their faces. But I was thinking that they will not work by itself if the men are not behind them. And also in the scale, it's a compromise, it's an acceptance, this situation of terror. This is my husband's face. He always was complaining that people never say hello to him. Like he blends so much here, and he was like, all the time dropping the topic to me that people don't recognize, but I had a meeting with this person, like I have a common face, common features. Many people don't have sculptures of themselves, and because we are regular, we are common. This piece, I think, has the topic of see me, recognize me. And I think he was happy. He was happy that, somebody makes something of him. I think I don't try to harass my viewers to feel guilty or to feel sad. If they feel something, they will search for more information, or they will just look at it as it is, a pleasant object or, art piece, and walk away. I don't feel offended. It's just something that I really love. If I can afford just something, to touch these topics or to help, even to open a communication, I'm happy about that.
Well, that's all we have for Prairie Pulse this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4, 2008. And by the members of Prairie Public.